The island we're visiting this evening is in the Mississippi River just above Minneapolis. My home is in the woods just on the left of the screen, opposite about the center of the island. I looked for a name for this on some old maps. I found it called Casey's Island, and then more recently it seemed to have been called Banfill Island. My attention was first called to this island some years ago by a friend of mine who said that it had been relatively undisturbed for nearly 75 years, was a very natural area, and he thought I would find it a very interesting place to carry on some studies. So I brought my canoe up there and paddled around, and I came to the same conclusion he did, that it was a very interesting spot. So we bought a few acres in the woods along the bank of the river there, opened up a place just large enough for our house, and we've been living there now for something over 30 years. Looking across from our side to the center of the island, we look over the narrow channel of the river. One of the first things that we noticed that seemed to be a little different from ordinary was the shape of the stones that were found on the bank of the river when the water was low. They didn't look like ordinary water-washed gravel. Some of the youngsters began noticing this and were picking up these oddly shaped stones, bringing them up to the house and commenting on their peculiar shapes. Looking over toward the bank, we could see where they had been washed out of the clay bank, exposing them, and sometimes a heavy rain would fall, washing away the clay and leaving these perched up on little pedestals, almost as though they were awaiting examination. Some of them, too, looked like 2 or 3 stones that had grown together. We don't ordinarily think of stones as growing, but these actually were, and the geologist refers to these as concretions. The story of just how they happened to have these very strange shapes was quite an interesting story. And after some investigation with the aid of a geologist, we came up with the explanation. If we cut the bank down with a huge knife, we would find that it was made up of 3 basic layers of soil. Down at the bottom is the dark reddish-brown clay we were looking at a moment ago. This was a layer that was laid down by a glacial invasion into this region about 12 or 15,000 years ago. This glacial ice moved in from the northeast up around Lake Superior. Then apparently this area became a quiet bay or a lake for some several thousand years, in which 20 to 25 feet of lake clay was laid down. Then along came the last of the glacial ice invasions into this region, laying down 6 or 8 feet of gray soil on top. This soil was different, and the glacial ice advanced from a different direction in bringing this type of soil in this case from the northwest, up in North Dakota and Manitoba. This upper layer of soil was a gray calcareous type of soil. The concretions grow in the lake clays and the brown clay below. Rain falling on the surface dissolves the calcium out of the upper layer, and as it percolates through the clay below, it deposits this calcium material around little organic centers. This is a section of clay with these centers indicated, and around those tiny centers the calcareous material deposits year after year, decade after decade, and as they grow more longitudinally than vertically, they begin to bump into each other and actually grow together. And this is the reason for these stones appearing to be made up of several. This particular set of centers produced a concretion that looks like this. So in a very small nutshell, this is the explanation of how these concretions happen to be in the clay at this point. We had a lot of fun simply entertaining ourselves with our imagination about these stones. This one we thought, for instance, looked a little bit like a woodchuck of some kind, and this one we identified as a penguin. The youngsters called this one Little Half Chick because the other side was perfectly flat. and this one we refer to as mother and children. Some of them were very thin, about as thick as corrugated paper, and this one looked like an elephant, brought up from further down the river a little ways. And farther down the river, they seem to be much more elongated than they are right in front of our house. So we had a lot of fun just studying the rocks, their shapes, and their origins. We were interested, too, in the plants that grew on our little few acres and on the island. We first collected a good many of these and identified them, such as the ostrich fern here, just uncurling its little fiddleheads in the spring of the year. And a little flower called the false turtle head blooms in early summer. A botanist friend told me that he called it the obedient plant because when you push the flowers aside, they stay where you put them as though their stems were made out of soft copper wire. I don't know of any other plant that reacts in this way. You perhaps have walked through a bed of nettles holding your hands up high to keep away from the irritation caused by the little thorns on the surface of the leaves. We do have two kinds of nettles growing here, a narrow-leafed one, which grows in the bright sunshine, and a wide-leafed one that gathers in the lesser light, growing under the shade of taller trees. Both of these, however, if examined under a microscope, you'll find that the surface of the leaves and the stems are all covered with tiny little hairs, which in magnification look like rather dangerous glassy thorns. A diagram of what we see under the microscope would look something like this. Since they prick your skin so readily, you would assume that the tip here would be very sharp, but that is not true. If we magnify that red circle, we find that the spine cell actually ends in a little bulb-like structure. But notice the white layer, which is the brittle, fragile layer, is very thin at this point on one side and here on the other side, so that when you touch the tip of this spine, it shatters on a diagonal line, leaving a very sharp point up at the tip, almost like a hypodermic needle. Now, if we turn back to our diagram again, we'll find that the spine cell is perched up on a little pedestal, and looking more carefully at this, it looks a bit like a rubber bulb, which is essentially what it is, because the same pressure that breaks the tip off of the cell compresses the bulbous base and injects the irritating fluid into your skin. So this was nature's hypodermic needle, actually, invented thousands of years before we began using an instrument like this in our medical treatments. When we talk about plants, we often think about them as being scattered around at random without any particular rhyme or reason, but this is not true. Here in a diagram of the island, I'm painting certain areas yellow, representing sandbars, which have developed along the side of the river. On those sandbars, and there only, does the long, narrow sandbar willow grow. The light green portions of the island here, diagrammed, represent those parts of the island that are flooded each spring when the water is very high. There we have certain species of trees that can grow that apparently are not damaged by having their roots underwater for some time. The cottonwood, and here the river maple or soft maple, and the box elder, these can all stand this kind of conditions without any damage. Here the dark part of the island represented is the part above the reach of the floodwaters, and here we have other species of trees that grow, which would be damaged by growing farther down in the floodwaters. The American elm or white elm that we're losing to the Dutch elm disease, and the basswood tree with its big heart-shaped leaves, very soft wood, has many values, and the hackberry tree, a close relative of the elm. These all grow up on the high part of the island, as does some of the shrubs. This is the red-berried elder, producing these brilliant scarlet berries in the early part of the summer, fed upon a great deal by many species of birds. It grows under the shade of the taller trees. And also some of the flowers that also grow on the upper part of the island include the Dutchman's breeches, so-called because of its odd shape, of course. And the bloodroot, one of the very earliest of our spring flowers, so called because the root broken will ooze a red sap like blood. Some people call this a dog-tooth violet. It has other names of adder tongue, and perhaps trout lily is the best name because it really is a miniature lily. I've never seen such a lush growth of this plant as on the higher, well-drained part of the island. So these plants all have their requirements, and they seem to grow only where those requirements happen to be met, and they're not just scattered about at random. Just because these plants have been growing at this particular place at this time doesn't mean they have always been growing there. We say this because of our studies of pollen grains. You're familiar with the hollyhock and the rather coarse type of pollen that it produces. Some of the other plants have flowers that one hardly recognizes as flowers at all, like the catkins of the bur oak, which produce their own particular type of pollen, and the larger pollen catkins of the white walnut or butternut, the little prickly ash producing a bright orange pollen. Most of this pollen drifts about in the air, blown about by the wind, and a great majority of it actually settles down onto the surface of the earth. And if some of this happens to settle on the surface of a quiet pond like this, it'll settle down into the sediments in the bottom and be preserved for literally thousands of years in a recognizable form. Here a paleobotanist is taking soil samples in a bog that used to be a quiet pond. If he brings up soil from near the surface, say, only 6 or 8 inches down, he can crush this up and examine it under a microscope, and will be able to identify the pollen grains of trees that grew there just within the last century or so. Some of these would be the rather simple pollen grain of the white elm or American elm, somewhat similar but slightly different grain of the paper birch. But if he goes on down and brings up soil samples from 6 or 8 feet down in the ground, he's very apt to bring up the majority of the pollen grains looking like this, which are really the pollen grains of coniferous trees, the cone-bearing pines and spruces, indicating that this island probably did support a heavy growth of, say, white pine, red pine, black spruce, balsam, maybe several other species, such as we find much farther north today. This change, of course, has taken place because of the change in the climate, and the climate of this area following the recession of the glacier has affected the animals too. Caribou, no doubt, moved across the narrow channel of the river, across to disappear into the black spruce that may have grown on the island at that time. Nowadays, the caribou has moved on north, and its place is taken by the white-tailed deer, which is still found on the island. Some of the other animals have also been affected by the change in climate. One of these is those of the rabbit family. Just after the glacier receded, we had the snowshoe rabbit that turns white in winter, characteristic of this area. Today, of course, the common rabbit is the cottontail rabbit, which remains brown or grayish throughout the whole year. The birds have also been affected by this change of climate. We have the raven, which used to be found here a few centuries ago, and for several thousand years it was a common bird here, no doubt. Nowadays, the raven has moved north, and its place is taken by the common crow, which we have here today. In the grouse family, the willow ptarmigan probably was picking at the buds on the scrubby willows that grew on the tundra here just after the glacial ice disappeared. Today, the willow ptarmigan has moved far up north, and when the pine and spruce came in, the spruce grouse became the common grouse of that area, sometimes called the fool hen, because it can be approached very closely. This bird, however, disappeared with the change from the pine and spruce to the broadleaf trees, and now the ruffed grouse is the characteristic native grouse of this part of the country. These are all changes, then, in the plant and animal life that have taken place within the last 10,000 years or more. We often ask the question, I wonder who was the first white person, European, to appear on the scene here. We have evidence that perhaps Father Hennepin was one of the earliest, at least, to leave a record of having actually visited this island. He was taken captive when he was exploring the upper Mississippi in 1680. The Indians took him from Lake Pepin here up the Mississippi. They apparently left their canoes at the present site of St. Paul and went overland up to Mille Lacs Lake, where he was held captive for several weeks. When he was released, he came down the Rum River, which empties into the Mississippi just above Casey's Island, and he may have actually camped on this island on his way down to his discovery of St. Anthony Falls. This is a picture of the falls in its original form, a painting made about 130 or 40 years ago. Today, of course, we hardly recognize the fact that there ever was a falls here because it's all locked up in a power dam, producing power for the Twin Cities here. A couple of 100 years after Father Hennepin's visit, another group of men appeared on the scene and left their mark. These are some of the tools of the lumberjacks who worked here in the exciting romantic period of heavy lumbering in this area. Undoubtedly, the storehouse boats, or wanigans, of the lumberjacks anchored at Casey's Island. And these were the storehouse boats meeting the very, very simple needs of the lumberjacks. And the bateaus, wooden bateaus, the type of boat that they use going to and from their work on their log drives. I was looking around on the island one day, and I found an odd little spike sticking up. Pulling on it, I found that it was a metal bar attached to the end of a rather short but heavy piece of chain. The other end, I discovered, had a large link, and it was obvious that that bar could be dropped through this link and flipped over, making a circle out of this heavy piece of chain. The lumberjacks referred to these as boom chains, and they were used to fasten the ends of logs together in this manner, making a chain of logs that could be stretched across the river, controlling the flow of logs down the river. Down at the lower end of the island were some little islands, some little cribbings made of logs by the lumberjacks and filled with stone. These, we discovered, were actually another anchor for log boom. We'll see the use of that in a moment. Here's a photograph taken about 75 or 80 years ago of a log jam in the river here. Logs jamming the river from bank to bank, and it took nearly 2 weeks to break up this jam. Still today, we find logs jutting out of the river bank, which were of those log jams in the early days. Some of these floated up onto the island and have been well enough preserved that you can still read the brands on the ends of the logs. This particular log had an HIN stamped on it. I looked it up in the records over in this Historical Society and found it belonged to the Northland Pine Company about 80 years ago. Up above the island are little groups of pilings that jut out of the water as the river drops during the summertime. These also were log boom anchorages, and they ran right down the center of the channel up above the island. The log boom on the left, where the men are walking, would be a log boom such as would be anchored to that, keeping the logs floating down the east side of the island or down the main channel, down to the mills only a few miles below. Now in the late fall, a boom would be put across those little cribbings at the lower end of the island. The big boom up above would be broken, and the logs were allowed to flow through into the west channel, filling this up completely in logs which they referred to as a mill pocket. This was allowed to freeze into the ice, and when the ice broke up in the spring, they would unhitch this boom at the lower end of the island, allowing the logs to float down to the mills only a few miles below, so they could get into action sawing before they had to wait for a drive to, say, come from 100 miles upstream. So the breakup of the river in the spring of the year was of great importance to the lumberjacks because it provided them with their only means of getting their logs down to the sawmills. Of course, the breakup of the ice in the spring with the big cakes floating in the current is still of great importance to the trees that grow along the banks of the river. Since this occurs at a high water level, great masses of ice are jammed in back of the trees, and their trunks are rather badly scarred up by the action of the ice, especially at the upper end of the island, where the cottonwood trees take a real beating. They are scarred very badly, and each summer the tree tries to grow over the scar. The next year it's scarred again, and some places we can see a half a dozen layers of wood, where year after year the tree has tried to heal over these scars. The breakup of the ice takes place here about the last few days of March or the first few days of April, and about that time, way up in the tops of these same cottonwood trees, we're very apt to see a great horned owl perching. This is a bird that is active at night normally. They nest very early in the year and have eggs in the nest in February when it may be 10, 15 below zero. By the end of March, they have young in the nest and perhaps are working long hours into the early morning feeding this family. And if they expose themselves, the crows in the neighborhood are almost sure to find the crow and to pester him and make life miserable for him until he can find some sort of protection in a hollow tree or a spruce tree or perhaps a grapevine tangle. The crows are just squaring accounts with the owl, actually, because the owl does prey on crows whenever he has the opportunity at night. We do have other owls that are also birds of prey, of course, in addition to the great horned owl here, which occasionally visit the island, although I doubt if they nest here because they are driven out by the horned owl. This is the barred owl, somewhat smaller, but still quite a large owl. These large birds of prey protect large territories and do not countenance competition. The osprey or fishhawk does not compete with the owl because this big hawk preys almost exclusively on fish. One of the prey species that is occasionally taken by the great horned owl is the ring-necked pheasant. We think of the pheasant as an open country bird usually, but here on the border between the forests and the prairies, which is the case right in this region, the pheasants often move into the woods. We see them moving through our yard occasionally over to the edge of the river, flying over to the island, and we hear them crowing over there where the cock pheasants are calling, inviting the females to come over and join the harem because, of course, the ring-necked pheasant is a polygamous bird. In crowing, they whir their wings very vigorously during the crowing call, which is the spring song, really, of the pheasant. And the hens would move over, and maybe a half a dozen might raise families on the island as a member of the harem of a single cock pheasant. An early arrival in the spring, just after the ice is broken up, is the great blue heron, sometimes mistakenly called a blue crane. The crane is really more a bird of the open prairies. This is a skillful fisherman fishing in the lagoon at the lower end of the island, taking frogs and toads and small fishes and salamanders. I even saw one swallow a chipmunk one day. One of the early forms available to the herons is the wood frog, which actually comes out and begins croaking in the spring before the ice has all melted. Later, the leopard frog begins blowing up these little balloons over his shoulders, which are really resonating chambers, increasing the carrying power of the croaking call of this species of frog. Still later in the spring, the green frog puts in its appearance. This is still larger than the spotted leopard frog, and the largest of the frogs found around here, a nice meal for a great blue heron, if he should come along at the right time. The herons, of course, come in several species and sizes. Here we have the black-crowned night heron, one of the middle size of the various species of herons, feeding in one of the lagoons at the lower end of the island here. The smallest of the heron species to be found on this island is the little green heron, about the size of a crow or perhaps a little smaller. This bird would be feeding on smaller forms of life, of course, than the great blue heron. And one of those little animal forms that would be very tasty for a green heron would be the tiny little newly metamorphosed toads, which are less than half an inch long when they first transform from their tadpole stage in the water. Defenseless little creatures, but beautifully protected by their color. Right below the ferrule on the knife here, you can hardly make out this little toad because he blends into his surroundings so perfectly. About mid-May, the warblers begin moving in. Here's the golden swamp warbler, or prothonotary warbler. Appears to be looking at its reflection in the water. A little later, it'll be looking for a hole probably bored by a downy woodpecker the year before as a nesting place. Another bird that might also be looking for a woodpecker hole in which to nest is the wood duck. This seems a little surprising to people who are not familiar with the habits of the wood duck. Here one is looking at the hole made by a big pileated woodpecker. Since they nest in natural cavities, they also take man-made houses readily, and I've had a lot of success with wood ducks nesting on my little 3-acre plot. I can occasionally go up and take the roof off of one of these houses and look down onto the incubating bird. The gray material surrounding the bird here is down that it's plucked off of its breast, and uses this to keep the eggs warm, cover the eggs with, to keep them warm when they're away feeding. Now, wood ducks do not carry food to their young in the nest, and the question is, how do these little fellows get feed when they're way up in the nest in the top of a tree? Well, of course, this means they have to get out of the nest very soon, or they would die of starvation. Early in the morning, usually around 7 to 8 o'clock, the old bird will suddenly pop out of the hole and perch in the hole, looking around very cautiously to see that everything is quiet outside. It drops to the ground when it's satisfied that everything is quiet and begins calling from the ground down below the nest. Then the little fellows begin climbing up into the doorway, listening to the call of the female down on the ground below, and they look around for a moment and then simply jump or tumble out of the nest. Here we're looking now at the other end of the fall and watching the little fellows hit the ground and literally bounce like little rubber balls. They're well protected by their springy down, and their bones, of course, at this age are very soft and rubbery, flexible, and they can stand a jolt like this without any injury at all. She's going to lead them across the river over to the island where they will find protection. One day, Mrs. Breckenridge was looking out of our back door, and she noticed this little tangled mass of fiber up in an oak tree. She recognized right away that it was a female Baltimore oriole that came in. I was glad she found this because I'd never seen the beginning stages in the development of an oriole's nest. Apparently what she does is swing a long loop of fiber down from the twig, and then standing in the loop like a youngster standing in a swing, she begins weaving the nest from side to side, enlarging the ropes of the swing, so to speak, until they completely surround her. Her technique is interesting. Up at the very top of the picture here, you see her poke a fiber out through the nest, and then she reaches over the twig up above and pulls it over, pokes it out again, and reaches over and pulls it in, wrapping it around and around the twig, firming up the support of the nest. Now, I noticed that most of these nests were very light-colored, almost white. I wondered what kind of material she was using in building this nest. So when she left to go get more material, I followed her around the other side of the house. She dropped in on these dead stalks that grew by our bird bath and began stripping off the bark. It was made of these tough, long fibers that were very much like linen thread. And looking up at the top of these dead stalks, we could see the long, narrow pods from the last year's growth, identifying it as the swamp milkweed, which looked like this the previous year when it was in blossom. We often will stake up these swamp milkweed stalks so they will not be broken down during the wintertime, making them available for the orioles to use for their nesting the next spring. And that particular very sturdy clump of stalks growing by the birdbath are visited year after year by orioles, sometimes 2 or even 3 females, stripping the bark off of those dead stalks to build their nests. Only the female works on this, securing the material and building the nest. And since this is one of the most elaborate of all the nests of our northern North American birds, it did take her quite a while to complete the construction, nearly 10 days. As the days went by, the walls of the nest became thicker and thicker. We could see less and less of the bird at its work. Finally, we only knew she was there when we would see the nest quivering a little, indicating that she was in there putting the finishing touches on the lining, presumably. Notice the oak leaves are very small at this stage, and you can see the nest quite well and see what's going on. It took the 10 days to build the nest, then 5 or 6 days for the laying of the clutch of eggs, and about 10 or 11 days for them to hatch. Here the male is coming in, helping to feed the young. So it was a cooperative project after all, with the male pitching in at that time. Another bird of our dooryard is the cedar waxwing, which loves mulberries, and we planted a mulberry tree especially for the waxwings. A few other birds also take it. Another bird with quite a different feeding habit is the broad-winged hawk. This is another predatory bird, of course, feeding on large insects and frogs, and in fact takes a good many snakes, toads, and small mammals. One of the small mammals that would interest a broad-winged hawk would be the tiny little long-tailed shrew, and it in turn feeds on snails. This happens to be a small species, about 3/4 of an inch across, which is quite common in the woods around here. And the size of the snail gives you a scale by which to judge the tiny size of this little shrew. It looks like a mouse, but it is actually not even closely related to a mouse. It's an insectivore with an entirely different tooth structure than the rodents. Very voracious little fellow, feeding on at least its own weight in food every day. And it's active all year long, under the snow in the wintertime, and under the grass and leaves during the summer. Very few people see this little fellow. He's so secretive. He is one of the smallest mammals in the world, about half as big as a house mouse. One day I had been working with some other forms. I had some shingles on the ground, and I picked them up and found underneath a little ball of grass, which puzzled me till I saw a female long-tailed shrew come in to take care of her little family, or her big family of little shrews, may be better stated. About as big as bumblebees, you notice, but they are already completely furred. I put them back into the nest, and immediately she came back in to take care of them. One of them must have been hungrier than any of the others, however, because when she suddenly decided to leave the nest, he didn't let go quickly enough and found himself several inches away from the nest. But even though he's still blind, his eyes are not open yet, he struggles about and finds his way back into the nest. Well, small mammals like this have a great many enemies. Skunks and dogs and cats and badgers and foxes and everything seem to prey on small mammals of this sort. So when I found how many enemies she had, and the fact that she had to raise 2 or 3 large families a year to maintain their population, I carefully replaced the board so she could go on raising her family. Another much larger mammal of the island was the woodchuck or groundhog. This is a land-dwelling animal, very closely related to the water-dwelling muskrats and beavers. So I was rather surprised one day to find a woodchuck out on one of these little rocky islands that the lumberjacks had built out in the middle of the river. It froze and tried to look like a boulder to escape notice, and did an awfully good job. It didn't move a whisker for several minutes. Then finally it seemed to recognize the fact that I was looking at it, and it started moving up to the upper end of the island. I wondered how good a swimmer a woodchuck was. And I discovered that it would plunge right into the water and swim just as well as a muskrat or beaver, but undoubtedly it couldn't dive like those animals can. It reached the sandbar, disappeared among the sandbar willows, and I got another little glimpse of it just before it disappeared up on the island. Another inhabitant of these little rocky islands built by the lumberjacks was the little spotted sandpiper, or sometimes called teeter snipe. Why they teeter so persistently, we really don't know. A close relative of the spotted sandpiper was the killdeer, with the two black rings around the neck. This was an interesting individual because it had decided to lay its eggs in the middle of the driveway of my neighbor. And every time he drove his car into the garage, he drove right over the nest, and the bird had to fly off, circle around, and then come back and settle down on the eggs. They're laid among the rocks here, you notice, that are just about the size and color of the stones around it, and the eggs are almost invisible. When we walked out the driveway, she would often fly off and put on her broken wing act, so to speak, where she imitates or appears to imitate a bird with a broken wing. With its natural enemies, this would naturally be very successful in luring them away from the nest. But she leads the enemy away 100 feet or more, and she suddenly recovers her powers of flight and goes back on the nest. Another creature of the river here, which few people know, is the soft-shelled turtle. Most people know the hard-shelled varieties of turtles, but the soft-shelled one is a stranger to most people. Sunning themselves on the tip of a little island in the river here. They're very shy, very alert. The youngsters beginning to play on a nearby sandbar. This is enough disturbance to frighten the turtles, and it only takes a couple of seconds and they're gone. However, as soon as the youngsters go back up to the house, why, they look around cautiously and then drag themselves back up on the sandbar to go on with their sunbathing. One of these turtles must have known something about vitamins. At least it wanted to expose as much of its body to the sun as it possibly could. And in doing so, it assumes a rather ridiculous position. With its feet up on edge this way, it looks like wheels on a little cart. And the handle of the cart, of course, is the neck and head, almost always up, looking around. They're very alert. The one on the right here sees something coming up the river. Can't quite identify it, apparently, and just to make sure, it takes to the water. The intruder, however, happened to be nothing more than a golden-eyed duck swimming along the edge of the sandbar here, and the turtle, recognizing this as not an enemy, it comes back up onto the sandbar and goes on with its sunbathing, while the golden-eyed duck goes ahead with a rather thoroughgoing water bath right alongside of the turtle. A little bit farther down the sandbar, a spall turtle was being visited by a couple of mourning doves that were picking up gravel for their gizzards, their little grist mills, with which they grind the hard seeds that they feed on. The name soft shell is very well taken because the edge of the shell is very flexible. Many people call them rubberbacks or leatherbacks. They have soft-appearing lips, partially covering a very sharp-cutting beak, however. And notice the eyes are well up above the level of the head, and the snout projecting out in front. It's constructed in such a way that it can float around in the water with nothing but the two eyes and the tip of the snout out of water. This turtle is an air-breathing creature, of course. The males are brown with little brown dark spots, whereas the female has a mottled pattern so different that you'd swear it was a different species of turtle. Both of them are so dark above that it is a bit surprising to turn them over and to find that underneath they're almost pure white. The tail of the female is very short, rarely projecting much at all beyond the edge of the upper shell, whereas the tail of the male is much larger, projecting well beyond the edge of the shell. The most striking difference in the sexes is size, however. A male rarely gets more than about 7 or 8 inches long, whereas the female may be 18 inches long and weigh 5 or 6 times as much as an adult male. I mentioned the fact they were very shy. Only once have I seen a female turtle laying her eggs, but the youngsters playing in the sand will sometimes find a nest of eggs of this turtle. The turtle actually comes up on the sand, excavates a hole with its hind feet, using them alternately in a circular motion, digging a hole shaped like a bottle. There she lays her eggs, covers them up with sand, and goes away and never returns, allowing the sun to hatch the eggs. So the eggs of a turtle do not have a standard incubation period, as do the eggs of birds, which are incubated and kept at a regular temperature. Some seasons these take much longer to hatch than others, and it's a matter of weeks before they will hatch. No matter how carefully they're covered, some of the enemies can spot them. The raccoon and the skunk are two of the effective enemies that will dig out the eggs of turtles, and here a raccoon had a nice meal of turtle eggs. Question often asked about these is how old are some of these large turtles? I looked in the literature and could find nothing on their rate of growth, so I engaged a little help from my son Tom, and we set about an experiment trying to determine how old some of these turtles actually did live to be. We got some turtle traps, put meat in these slotted tin cans suspended in the back of the traps, and we would take them out along the shallow water by the island, stake them down so the current would not roll the traps away. It would carry the odor from the meat downstream, however, and the turtles swimming around below the traps would move up and into the open mouths of the traps, which were pointing downstream. This was a very good technique for capturing the turtles that we wanted for our experiment. Sometimes we'd pick up a trap in the morning with as many as a half a dozen turtles in the trap. We expected to find other species because there are about 6 or 7 species found in this area. One of the commonest is the snapping turtle, and only twice in about 6 years did we find a snapping turtle in our trap. It's common, but not in swift-flowing, rocky-bottomed rivers. They live largely in muddy swamps and lakes. So this explained why we didn't get any snapping turtles. We never did get a map turtle, which is common in the river. This turtle feeds on clams and snails and isn't interested in the food that we were using as bait in our traps. And we never did capture one of the map turtles. When we caught a soft shell, I'd bring it up to the house, measure it very carefully, the width of its shell and the length of the shell, and put this down in my notebook. And I wanted to get at least an approximate weight of each individual turtle. Although they didn't care too much about riding pickyback on our kitchen scale, they sort of made a merry-go-round game out of it. But they would gradually settle down so I could get an approximate weight, put that in my notebook. Then I wanted to be able to identify these turtles individually when I let them go. So with a leather punch, I cut little notches in the edge of the shell in the pattern of the hours on the face of a clock. I discovered that only 2 or 3 notches would identify over 200 of these turtles. Then, with a little help from my daughter Barbara, we'd take them down to the river, let them go, hoping to capture them again later, and measure the amount of growth that had taken place in the meantime. We caught a good many of them several months after having liberated them. One we actually caught 7 years after it was originally marked. I finally got enough data to construct this curve. And now if somebody brings me a turtle and I measure its shell and it proves to be, say, 10 inches long, a 10-inch turtle is apt to be about 10 years old. If the turtle brought in is somewhat larger, say it's 13 inches long, it will not be 13 years old because they grow much more slowly as they grow larger. A 13-inch turtle would be about 20 years old. And this next turtle you'll see is the largest spiny soft-shelled turtle on record, which was taken in the Mississippi just above the island here. This proved to be 18 inches long, and it weighed 17 pounds and reached the theoretical maximum on my chart and must have been about 50 years old. So after about 6 years of work, we could answer the question, how old are some of these turtles? It sounds like a very simple question that you could just get by looking in the books, but this is how much work goes to putting the proper answer into the book. Well, changing now from tortoises to tortoiseshell butterflies, this is a Milbert's tortoiseshell, a species of butterfly that is active well into the late fall and even on warm days in the early part of the winter. You may see this insect flitting about in the woods. Question is, how do they survive the winter? Well, this and the common tortoiseshell here simply go into a hollow tree and hang themselves up there and wait for spring. They apparently develop in their bodies a type of antifreeze, a sort of glycerin material in the body fluids, which cause the ice crystals to form very, very small, small enough that they do not shatter the cell walls. So apparently that makes it possible for these butterflies to actually freeze in the wintertime and then thaw out in the spring. The morning cloak does the same thing. Winters in hollow trees. One fall along the latter part of August, I was looking around in the woods, and I found in a little sunny spot an unusual number of large brown butterflies flitting about. These I recognized, as you probably would, very readily as monarch butterflies. And these were not gathering here because of any particularly favorable hollow tree in which they were going to hibernate. This is one of the famous insect migrants. Dr. Urquhart, living and working at the University of Toronto, has tagged with tiny paper tabs with numbers, hundreds and hundreds of these butterflies, and some of those butterflies have been picked up and the numbers returned to him from southern Texas and northern Mexico, 1,600 miles or a little more from Toronto. They gathered in large numbers on the dead branches along the edge of my woods and in the leaves themselves, looking like dead leaves as they hung there quietly. They do not leave in a swarm, I found, although I wasn't actually present when they actually left. I've seen them traveling across country, and they're usually in a long straggling line, just two or three in appearance at a time. But if you're traveling in the late fall or in the late summer, September, and you notice brown monarch butterflies flying across the road, you'll notice they're almost always flying south because they have this directional ability. They move clear down to the Gulf of Mexico, and rarely do you find an adult monarch butterfly north of about this line in the wintertime. In the spring, they turn about and start returning to the north. One day I was looking at one of my duck houses. I noticed the doorway was blocked with something. I took my binoculars and looked closely and discovered an interesting little face looking out at me. The gray phase of the screech owl. The little screech owls often will use our wood duck houses for way stations, you might say. During the day, they're active at night when the ducks are not using them. This bird flew over to a dead ironwood tree and snuggled up against the trunk, right next to a rotted spot in the trunk. And I really believe the bird knew that it was putting on a very convincing demonstration of protective coloration. You cannot tell where the owl leaves off and the dead wood begins. The patterns match so perfectly. Even moving right up close, you still cannot be sure which is wood and which is feathers. It allowed me to photograph it, and then later, when I left, it flew back up into the house. In the fall, the colors begin to change, of course, during Indian summer, the woodbine turning red, the sumacs turning brilliant red or orange, too, and I have a somewhat obstreperous red maple in my woods that turns bright yellow every fall instead of red, as most of them do. An ash tree turns a bright golden yellow. Some of the oaks take on some reds, although most of them are rather a dull brown. Some of the fruits, of course, ripen at this time, many of them, including the burning bush, or euonymus, has a little orange and reddish berry. Looks something like the bittersweet, although the bittersweet is a vine. This is a bush. The high bush cranberry, bright red berries that make very good jelly. The leaves hold on for a few days and then loosen their holds and finally are blown to the ground, and we have apparently dead trees with us during the winter time. The pattern of the leafless branches of the bur oak was interesting against the blue sky. Over on the island, one fall, a very industrious little family of beaver moved in and began cutting poplar trees and cottonwoods along the bank, almost 2 feet in diameter, some of these trees that they took down. And they were doing something that beaver don't usually do, and that is take the bark off of the trunk of the tree. It must have had a very tasty inner bark, because normally they feed only on the branches and twigs. Highly nocturnal. I could photograph them only occasionally in the early morning. You doubtless know about the engineering ability of the beaver in building houses and dams. I wonder if you've seen the food pile built by a beaver. This was cut and anchored along the shore and to the bottom in such a way that it would not float away, and it freezes into the ice during the winter time and is available to the beaver as food under the ice. It can dive out from its underwater entrance to its burrow, swim along and cut off the material, bring it back into the house in the winter for food. They have a way of slapping their tail on the water to supposedly alarm their brothers who might be working on land. This perhaps is just a nervous reaction to disturbance, but they do raise their big canoe paddle-like tails up and slap it on the water, making a resounding smack like hitting the palm of your open hand on the water. Very rapid action and hard to see just what goes on. Well, another almost beaver-sized mammal on the island is the raccoon, again a highly nocturnal animal. We know it's there, however, because it leaves its little hand-like footprints along the muddy shores, where it dabbles after clams and snails, which make up part of its food. The hollow trees along the bank in the fall and winter are of interest to the raccoon because they use these for their denning places for the winter, although the raccoon is not really a hibernator. It does sleep a large part of the winter, becoming active occasionally trying to seek food, but usually not getting much and living largely on its fat throughout the winter. After the freeze-up, the snows come. Here a mass of snow on a dead limb looks like a broad ribbon draped over the dead twigs as it begins to slump in the sun. After the snows do come, of course, a good many of our birds have left, and their places are taken by birds that come down from the Arctic. Very hardy winter birds. Among them is a tiny little redpoll, about the size of a goldfinch, feeding on the tiny little seeds of the nettle plant that we were looking at under the microscope a while ago. These are gregarious little birds. They like to be in large flocks, and often along with the redpolls we'll find wintering goldfinches, which puzzle a great many people because the goldfinch in the wintertime is not yellow as it is in the summer. This is the redpoll here, but here the goldfinch, gray with just a suggestion of red in its winter coat. The cedar waxwings will sometimes show up here in the wintertime. It was 10 below zero, I remember, when I took this picture. They were feeding on bittersweet berries, and the Bohemian waxwing, somewhat larger, a bit more colorful than the cedar waxwing. These are benefited greatly by our planting of ornamental crab trees. Some of these produce small crab apples, which are so small you might even call them berries, and the Bohemian waxwings actually will swallow these little apples whole, although sometimes they seem almost to be strangling in the effort. Another winter bird is the evening grosbeak. The name grosbeak refers to the large bill, of course. Very powerful. They're interested in apples too, the large apples as well as the smaller ones. And it's interesting that in the case of the evening grosbeak, it cuts through the apple part of the apple in order to get at the core. There it picks out the seeds out of the core, cracks them with its heavy bill, and feeds on the oily meat on the inside of the seed. A very good warmth-producing winter food for birds of this sort. So they're interested in the core of the apple that we throw away, and they disregard the part of the apple that we eat. Some of our birds, of course, are permanent resident. They do not migrate at all, and the big pileated, or it can correctly also be called a pileated woodpecker, cutting out large chips out of a dead elm tree here, almost the size of a crow, and a powerful bird cutting enormously large holes in dead trees that may be heavily infested with wood borers, because the wood borers make up a good share of the food of this big woodpecker. Here a dead box elder tree had an enormous cavity cut, almost a bushel of chips lying on the ground below. During the winter time, the pheasant has to be even more alert than it does in the summer, because the great horned owl, one of its enemies, is also a permanent resident bird, as is the pheasant, of course. But the pheasant is pretty sharp about escaping enemies, as well as the owl, rather sharp in capturing its enemies, and it usually comes out a tie. If the predator destroys its prey, of course, the predator would die also. Sometimes in midwinter we have a sudden drop in temperature, and we'll wake up in the morning to find an ice fog in the air, tiny microscopic crystals of ice drifting around in the air, breaking up the rays of the sun in such a way that the entire atmosphere seems to be glowing. Not a common thing. Some winters will go by with hardly a good example of an ice fog occurring. This usually lasts only for an hour or two in the early morning. Then the rays of the sun are melting, dispelling the ice crystals out of the air. And with the sky turning blue, we see that these same conditions will often bring about this heavy deposit of frost, hoarfrost, on the trees, really decorating it up in a wonderful fashion, as we're all familiar with, I'm sure, who live up in the north. Very fragile hoarfrost crystals, however. The slightest vibration will shatter them, and with the wind usually starting to blow in the middle of the day, the show is usually over by about noon. There are places in the river that do not freeze over in spite of the 20 or 30 below zero that it sometimes becomes, where the rapids are, of course. I had an unusual opportunity to look down on the unfrozen pattern of the river a few winters ago, when a neighbor of mine became connected with the first commercial helicopter service in the state. He knew I was studying the island, and he asked if I would like to take a look at it from the air, and of course I did. So we're looking out through the big plastic bubble on the helicopter, down on the island. The dark pathway curving left around the island here is the unfrozen channel, which will expand during warm weather and then shrink down when a cold spell comes along. but rarely, if ever, will this particular area freeze over completely. And it's fortunate that there are these openings in the river, because there are certain forms of animal life that depend on these openings for their livelihood during the winter, and one of them is the golden-eyed duck, or whistler sometimes called. These peculiar antics some of them are going through are courting performances. They seem to go through these in the winter, not just in the spring when you would expect them to be courting. These are very expert diving ducks. They can dive down 20, 30, 40 feet deep if necessary to get to the bottom, where they feed on crayfish and hibernating aquatic insect forms of various sorts. They only rarely feed on fish, very, very little on fish. They spend almost their entire time in the air or swimming about in the water. Very rarely do they hop up and perch on the ice rim. And actually they keep warm in the water there, because if it's 20 below zero in the air, the water is 32 above, or a bit warmer, otherwise it would be ice. So they keep warm by staying in the water. I found about 4:30 in the afternoon they would always take off and fly downstream. I followed them, and they flew down several miles past the big smokestacks of the power plant in North Minneapolis. They continued to fly on down past the big power towers with their intersecting power lines, over 2 or 3 of the city bridges, and between the Broadway and Plymouth bridges these birds would set their wings and drop down onto the water at that particular place. And after studying their movements for several winters, I found that almost the entire population of golden eyes, from well above Minneapolis to almost down to St. Paul, some miles below, they all concentrated at this point every night, coming from both upstream and downstream, dropping in flock after flock until it got so dark that I couldn't photograph them even against the sunset, and by that time there might be as many as 500 or 600 of these birds concentrated at this particular open spot in the river. As it got darker, they moved closer and closer together. Finally, in a little raft, maybe only 30 or 40 feet across, they would spend the night swimming and sleeping at the same time. How they do this is still rather puzzling. But actually, long before the daybreak in the morning, at the very crack of dawn, they would break up their flock and begin flying up and down the river, again picking out their favorite fishing holes, or swimming holes, as you might call it. And here, just above the island, a little group of them are diving down to get their breakfasts of crayfish and caddisflies. This was the regular daily activity pattern of these whistler or golden-eyed ducks throughout the entire winter, from the freeze-up, which is usually early in December, until about the end of March. I knew that there was another group of ducks that were also wintering above the island. This was a group of mallards with a little scattering of black ducks. These are quite different in their habits. These are called shallow-feeding ducks, or surface-feeding ducks, or puddle ducks. They spend a good deal of the time on the ice, walking around on the ice. They cannot dive deeply down like the whistlers. They simply will feed by standing on their heads, so to speak, and reaching down as far as they can. The two species rarely associate together, but this day the one goldeneye there on the right came over to visit with the mallards, and seeing them perched on the ice, he thinks he'll try it too. And when he does, notice how clumsy he really is. He has to flap his wings even to turn around. The whistler or diving ducks have bigger feet and shorter legs, seem to be placed a little farther back, and they just aren't built for walking around on a hard surface like this mallard on the right, stalking along and slipping back into the water very easily. Well, in the morning, these mallards will swim out into the water, play around, and if they find a very shallow place, they might feed a little around the bottom, but very shortly they will take off. They're not going down the river or up the river to meet with any other groups of mallards, but they're flying out into the surrounding country, where they're looking for a cornfield in which they can feed. As we raise varieties of corn farther north, the mallard ducks are more successful in wintering farther north because they depend on the corn so much for their winter food. Here, a cornfield right on the riverbank, I sometimes say this group chose a deluxe situation. All they have to do is fly up over the trees and drop down into the cornfield for their breakfast. As soon as they've filled their crops, they drop back onto the water, swim around. You notice they're not diving like the whistlers or golden eyes did. They'll gradually move over toward the edge of the ice. This is in midwinter, after the hunting season, of course. And they'll soon hop up onto the edge of the ice. Some of you may be able to identify a few of the black ducks that come in here. The black duck is a more common bird farther east at the Atlantic coast. After getting on the ice, they pull their feet up off the cold surface, tuck their bills under their back feathers, and sleep there during the day. Long late in the afternoon, they get hungry again, however. The flock will all take off, and sometimes late in the winter, they may have to fly out 10 or 15 miles in order to find a good cornfield in which they can glean enough grain. Then they come back onto the surface, hop up onto the ice, where they spend the night. Entirely different in their actions, and when the ice breaks up in the spring, the mallards will move out to nest on the ground in the prairie areas, while the whistler moves up into the north and nests in holes in trees, as does the wood duck. So they differ both winter and summer in their habits. Later on in the season, you'll perhaps see my canoe pulled up along one of the bars on the island, where I'll be studying some more of the interesting natural history of this very fine natural area. By this time, you may recognize why I call it island treasure, because I feel that I've gotten some very tangible treasures out of my experiences with the wildlife of this particular island, and I won't have to look for any pot of gold, which I assume will sometime be found there.